Three specific breads, sprouted grain bread, authentic sourdough, and dense pumpernickel, can cut your blood sugar spikes by 20 to 40% compared to white bread. And clinical trials published in peer-reviewed medical journals back every single one of them. Today we're covering exactly which breads they are, why they work, which brands to grab at the store, and a dead simple trick at the end that slashes your blood sugar response by nearly 40%, using bread you already have at home. Before we get into the three breads, let's talk about why this matters so much if you're over 60. The CDC's National Diabetes Statistics Report, published January 2026 using 2023 data, puts the number of Americans with diabetes at 40.1 million, which comes out to 12% of the entire population. 11 million of those people don't even know they have it. Another 115.2 million adults are living with prediabetes. But the number that should really grab your attention is this one. Among adults 65 and older, 52.1% have prediabetes. More than half of American seniors already have blood sugar that's out of balance. And that's where bread enters the picture. Americans consume roughly 44 to 53 pounds of bread per person every year, making it one of our most common daily foods. Choosing the right type of bread turns out to be one of the simplest and most effective dietary switches for managing diabetes or prediabetes, especially when combined with proper medication management from your healthcare provider. The American Diabetes Association spells it out in their 2025 to 2026 standards of care. They recommend choosing, and this is a direct quote, minimally processed, nutrient-dense, high-fiber carbohydrate sources over refined grains. Their guidelines call for at least 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories consumed, and they state that reducing overall carbohydrate intake has demonstrated the most evidence for improving glycemia. These recommendations align closely with established eating patterns like the Mediterranean diet and DASH diet that emphasize whole grains over processed options. The ADA isn't telling you to give up bread, they're telling you to pick the right bread. And that's exactly what we're going to cover right now. But first, let's break down why regular white bread wrecks your blood sugar. Because once you understand the problem, the three solutions click into place. Two measurements tell the story: glycemic index, or GI, and glycemic load, or GL. Glycemic index ranks foods on a 0 to 100 scale based on how fast they raise blood glucose, with low being 55 or below, medium 56 to 69, and high 70 or above. Glycemic load adjusts that number for serving size, giving you a more realistic snapshot of what happens when you eat a normal portion. Think of glycemic index as the speed and glycemic load as the total impact. White bread lands at a glycemic index of about 75. Pure glucose, the reference point, sits at 100, which means white bread gets you roughly 3/4 of the way to eating straight sugar, in terms of how fast it hits your bloodstream. The reason comes down to grain structure. Milling strips the bran and germ from wheat, removing the fiber and protein that naturally slow digestion. What remains is ultra-fine white flour with maximum starch surface area exposed to your digestive enzymes. One slice of white bread delivers 12 to 14 grams of carbohydrates alongside barely 1 gram of fiber. Without fiber, fat, or protein to buffer absorption, glucose floods your bloodstream within 15 to 30 minutes, peaks around the 60-minute mark, and triggers an outsized insulin response. That's the problem. Now here are the three solutions. Each of these breads relies on a completely different technique to change how your body handles starch. One uses sprouting, one uses fermentation, and one uses the physical structure of the grain itself. We're starting with the bread that outperforms everything else in head-to-head clinical trials. Number 1, sprouted grain bread. No other bread type studied produces a lower glycemic response than sprouted grain bread. Its glycemic index ranges from 36 to 50, firmly in the low category, and the glycemic load sits at just 5 to 6 per slice. White bread clocks in at 75, so we're talking about roughly half the glycemic impact. The most recognized sprouted grain bread in the United States is Ezekiel 4.9, made by Food for Life. One slice, 34 grams, delivers 80 calories, 15 grams of total carbohydrates, 3 grams of fiber, 12 grams of net carbs, 4 grams of protein, and 0 grams of sugar. What sets sprouted grain bread apart starts with the production process itself. Grains are soaked in water and allowed to begin germinating before they're milled into flour. And that germination triggers several changes. The seed burns through some of its own starch for energy as it starts to grow, leaving less starch to spike your blood sugar. Resistant starch, the type that resists digestion and moves through your system slowly, increases during sprouting. Anti-nutrients like phytic acid drop by up to 90%, which improves mineral absorption. protein bioavailability also rises. Ezekiel bread stands out even further because it blends 6 sprouted grains and legumes: wheat, barley, millet, lentils, soybeans, and spelt. That combination creates a complete protein, which is unusual for any bread. But the clinical evidence is what truly separates sprouted grain from the pack. Mofidi and colleagues ran a randomized crossover trial published in the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism in 2012, testing 12 overweight and obese men. Sprouted grain bread triggered significantly lower glucose responses than 11-grain bread, sourdough bread, and white bread, with strong statistical significance across all comparisons. On top of that, sprouted grain bread raised GLP-1, an incretin hormone that helps regulate insulin secretion, more than the other bread types. What makes the evidence even more convincing is a study published that same year by Najjar and colleagues in the Journal of Functional Foods, which tested bread specifically in adults with diet-controlled type 2 diabetes. 12 subjects participated, and blood glucose area under the curve came in significantly lower after sprouted bread compared to every other bread type tested, including whole-grain sourdough, white sourdough, and standard white bread. Even the second meal insulin response dropped significantly. These aren't lab-only results. This is real data from real people managing diabetes. Amanda Siprich, a registered dietitian nutritionist and type 1 diabetes nutritionist, specifically recommends Ezekiel 4:9. Her advice for diabetics is to look for bread with at least 3 grams of fiber per serving and 4 grams of protein, and Ezekiel 4:9 meets both of those thresholds. One practical detail to keep in mind: because Ezekiel bread contains no preservatives, you'll almost always find it in the freezer section of your grocery store, and it needs to stay frozen at home too. As you'll hear later on, that freezer storage actually becomes a bonus for your blood sugar. Now let's move to bread number 2, which lowers blood sugar through an entirely different mechanism. Number 2, sourdough bread. Traditional sourdough bread reaches a glycemic index of 48 to 54. That's not quite as low as sprouted grain, but it still falls in the low to moderate range, and the way it gets there is genuinely different from anything else on this list. Sourdough relies on lactic acid fermentation. Instead of commercial yeast, a sourdough starter contains naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria. And during the 12 to 24-hour fermentation process, those bacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid. These organic acids physically alter the starch structure of the bread, making it harder for digestive enzymes to break it down. The science supporting this stretches back decades. Liljeberg and colleagues published a foundational study in the Journal of Nutrition in 1995, showing that organic acids in sourdough significantly lowered postprandial blood glucose and insulin. A year later, Liljeberg and Björk demonstrated in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that acetic acid delays gastric emptying, meaning your stomach processes the bread more slowly, which slows glucose absorption into the bloodstream. Multiple studies have also confirmed that fermentation boosts resistant starch content by up to nearly 30% in whole wheat sourdough. A 2022 meta-analysis by Araujo and colleagues pulled together 18 clinical trials and found sourdough bread consumption produces significantly lower postprandial glycemia, with a mean difference of negative 0.21 millimoles per liter at the 120-minute mark compared to other breads. But here's the study that matters most for our audience. Maioli and colleagues tested sourdough bread in 2008 in a study published in Acta Diabetologica, and their 16 subjects ranged from 52 to 75 years old with impaired glucose tolerance. That's the exact population we're talking about: seniors navigating prediabetes. Sourdough bread brought plasma glucose down significantly at the 30-minute mark, and the incremental area under the curve came in significantly lower at both 30 and 60 minutes. One interesting wrinkle comes from a 2017 cell metabolism study by Coram and colleagues, who tested 20 people and discovered that glycemic responses to bread turn out to be highly personalized and microbiome dependent. About half of participants responded better to sourdough, while the other half responded better to white bread. A finding that reminds us population average glycemic index values serve as guides, not guarantees. If you have access to a continuous glucose monitor, that remains the best way to know how your body handles specific foods. The ADA's 2025-2026 Standards of Care now recommends CGM technology for more patients precisely because of this individual variability in glucose response. Jenna Sager, a registered dietitian at Boston University School of Medicine, points out that sourdough fermentation can reduce the phytate content of bread by around 62%. improving mineral absorption on top of the blood sugar benefits. And this brings us to an absolutely critical warning. Not all bread labeled sourdough is real sourdough. Many commercial brands use vinegar or flavoring shortcuts to mimic the taste without the actual fermentation process, which means you lose the blood sugar benefits entirely. Authentic sourdough should list only flour, water, salt, and sourdough culture as ingredients. If you spot yeast on the label, that's not genuine sourdough. Check every time. All right, let's get into the third bread, which works through the most straightforward mechanism of the bunch. Number 3, dense whole grain bread with intact kernels, especially pumpernickel. This category covers pumpernickel, intact kernel rye bread, and dense whole grain breads where you can actually see and feel pieces of grain when you hold a slice. Pumpernickel reaches a glycemic index of 41 to 46, while whole kernel rye bread scores 41 to 55. Both land far below commercial whole wheat bread, which sits at 65 to 74. And that brings us to one of the most misunderstood facts about bread and diabetes. Standard commercial 100% whole wheat bread, the kind most people buy thinking they're making a healthy choice, carries a glycemic index of about 69. White bread comes in at about 75. That gap is almost nothing. You might feel good about choosing whole wheat, but your blood sugar can barely tell the difference. The culprit is modern milling. Even though whole wheat flour technically retains the bran and germ, grinding it so fine completely destroys the physical grain structure. And your digestive enzymes access the starch nearly as easily as they do with white flour. Reynolds and colleagues proved this in 2 landmark studies published in Diabetes Care in 2020. The first tested 15 adults with type 2 diabetes and revealed an inverse linear relationship between grain particle size and postprandial glycemia, meaning the larger the grain pieces in the bread, the lower the blood sugar spike. Their second study, a 2-week crossover trial with 28 participants wearing continuous glucose monitors, confirmed that less processed whole grains produce better glycemia than finely milled equivalents, even when the nutrient content was identical. Sit with that for a moment. Same nutrients, same fiber, same protein. Yet the bread with bigger grain pieces produced lower blood sugar because the physical structure was doing the heavy lifting. An earlier BMJ study by Holt and colleagues confirmed this pattern, showing breads with increasing proportions of intact whole grain kernels had a significant trend toward lower glycemic index and dramatically lower in vitro digestibility. The grains are literally harder for your body to break down. Traditional pumpernickel fits this profile perfectly because it's made from whole rye kernels baked at low temperature for 16 to 24 hours, a slow process that preserves grain structure rather than destroying it. Long-term evidence backs this category up too. Ghafouri Talagani and colleagues ran a 12-week intervention in 2021 where they swapped white bread for whole wheat bread in type 2 diabetes patients and found significant reductions in HbA1c, body weight, triglycerides, total cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol alongside an increase in HDL cholesterol. A 2022 meta-analysis in the Journal of Diabetes Investigation synthesized 32 randomized controlled trials covering more than 2,000 participants and confirmed significant inverse regulation of fasting glucose with whole grain consumption in what appeared to be a dose-dependent relationship. The takeaway is to look for breads where intact grain kernels are visible: pumpernickel, dense rye, sprouted multigrain with visible seeds. If the bread feels soft, fluffy, and smooth, even with a whole wheat label, it's probably milled too fine to deliver the blood sugar benefit you need. Now let me walk you through the specific brands you can find at the grocery store, along with how they stack up against each other. Here are the key numbers for the most popular diabetes-friendly bread brands available in the United States. The figure to focus on is net carbs per slice, which is total carbs minus fiber. At the lowest end of the spectrum, Nature's Own Life Keto Multigrain comes in at just 1 gram of net carbs per slice with 40 calories and 9 grams of fiber. Carbonaut Low Carb Original follows close behind at 1 to 2 grams of net carbs, 70 calories, and 7 grams each of fiber and protein. Schmidt 647 Wheat, mainly available in the Northeast, delivers 6 grams of net carbs, 40 calories, and 7 grams of fiber, while Sara Lee Delightful sits at about 6.5 grams of net carbs with 45 calories per slice. Moving into the mid-range, Dave's Killer Bread Good Seed Thin Sliced hits 10 grams of net carbs at 70 calories with 3 grams of fiber and 4 grams of protein. Their 21 Whole Grains Thin Sliced carries 11 grams of net carbs. Our top pick, Ezekiel 4.9, comes in at 12 grams of net carbs, 80 calories, 3 grams of fiber, 4 grams of protein, and 0 grams of sugar. Silver Hill's Big 16 sprouted lands at 13 grams of net carbs with an impressive 6 grams of protein. On the higher end, Pepperidge Farm 100% whole wheat has 17 grams of net carbs and 110 calories. But here's a distinction worth understanding. The lowest net carb breads like Carbonaut, Nature's Own Keto, and Schmidt 647 hit those numbers through modified starches and added processed fiber. Meanwhile, the most whole food options like Ezekiel 4.9 and Silver Hills achieve their nutrition from intact, minimally processed ingredients but carry higher net carbs. Both approaches have merit depending on your individual goals, and the best choice depends on how your body responds. For availability, Carbonaut has expanded to Costco, Whole Foods, and Sprouts nationwide. Dave's Killer Bread thin-sliced varieties show up at virtually every major U.S. grocery chain. Ezekiel 4.9 and Silver Hills live in the freezer aisle because they don't contain preservatives. Now, as promised, here's the simple trick that can reduce your blood sugar response by up to 39% with bread you already own. It's called the freeze and toast method, and strong science backs it up. A 2008 study in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition tested 10 subjects and found that freezing bread and then toasting it knocked the blood sugar response down by 39%. Freezing alone reduced it by 31%, and toasting alone by 25%, but combining the two delivered the strongest effect. Here's what happens at the molecular level. When bread enters the freezer, starch molecules undergo a process called retrogradation, where they rearrange into crystalline structures that resist digestive enzymes. The bread looks and tastes the same once you pop it in the toaster, but the starch is structurally different, and your body can't convert it to glucose as quickly. A 2023 randomized controlled trial with 32 subjects confirmed this. Peak blood sugar hit 132 milligrams per deciliter for fresh bread, compared to 120 milligrams per deciliter for frozen and reheated bread. Your action step is straightforward. Buy your bread, store it in the freezer, and toast your slices when you're ready to eat. This works with any bread, but pairing it with an already low glycemic bread like sprouted grain or sourdough stacks the benefits even higher. Two more practical strategies deserve your attention, and both come from published research. Meal composition and food order make an enormous difference. Research published in Frontiers in Nutrition in 2022 showed that eating protein, fat, and fiber before starchy foods can drive down postprandial blood glucose by up to 73% and insulin levels by 48%. This approach mirrors successful meal patterns found in the Mediterranean diet and DASH diet protocols. When you sit down to a meal, start with your vegetables and protein before touching the bread. Or pair your bread with avocado, eggs, nut butter, or hummus. Just don't eat bread on an empty stomach by itself. The second strategy involves what researchers call the second meal effect, first described by Dr. David J. Jenkins at the University of Toronto in 1982. When you eat high-fiber, low glycemic index foods at one meal, your glycemic response at the next meal improves too, even hours later. Nielsen and colleagues found in the British Journal of Nutrition that barley kernel-based bread eaten at dinner reduced the glucose response at breakfast by about 26% compared to white wheat bread. But this effect requires intact kernels, and finely milled whole wheat bread does not produce it. Before wrapping up, let me address a few common questions and misconceptions, because a lot of confusion surrounds this topic. Should diabetics cut out bread completely? A real debate exists around this. The low-carb community often pushes for total elimination, but the American Diabetes Association disagrees. Dr. Brittany Bussey, Chief Medical Officer of Vital Health, put it bluntly, saying, quote, "I say, let them eat bread. People with diabetes are faced with many restrictions that are oftentimes impossible to adhere to for a lifetime," end quote. Mary Ellen Phipps, a registered dietitian nutritionist with a master's in public health who lives with diabetes herself, offered her own perspective, saying, quote, "As a dietitian living with diabetes myself, I love bread and enjoy it all the time. You can eat both types while living with diabetes," end quote. The answer isn't eliminating bread entirely. It's choosing the right bread in the right amounts alongside proper medical management, which may include medications like metformin or insulin as prescribed by your healthcare provider. What about gluten-free bread for diabetics? This is one of the biggest misunderstandings out there. A systematic review of 132 gluten-free bread samples revealed that over 60% carried high glycemic indexes. Because gluten-free bread typically relies on high glycemic ingredients like rice flour, tapioca, and potato starch. Mary Ellen Phipps warned directly about this, saying, quote, "There's a common misconception that gluten-free bread is better for people with diabetes. It can be, but it also can be much worse," end quote. Unless you have celiac disease or a diagnosed gluten sensitivity, gluten-free bread offers no blood sugar advantage. Label tricks are another trap to watch for. Harvard Health research found that 29 to 47% of consumers incorrectly identify less healthy products as better. When misled by front-of-package claims like multigrain or wheat, the Center for Science in the Public Interest discovered that products labeled wheat bread often list enriched flour, which means refined flour, as the first ingredient. Registered dietitian Becky Hand nailed it when she explained, quote, "These terms essentially mean nothing. The bread could very likely be an enriched white flour bread with some brown coloring and a few crunchy seeds sprinkled in. It's just white bread with some makeup on," end quote. The fix is easy. Look for 100% whole wheat or 100% whole grain as the first ingredient listed. Not wheat flour alone, not multigrain, not made with whole grains. Those phrases mean nothing. A quick word on keto breads rounds out the picture. They do help control net carbs, and several appear in the brand comparison I covered earlier. Just be aware that some contain sugar alcohols like maltitol or erythritol that partially metabolize and can still bump your blood sugar despite being subtracted from the net carb count on the label. Many also run higher in fat and calories, with fiber sourced from added processed ingredients rather than whole grains. One final piece of recent research ties everything together. The Carb Health trial, published in 2025 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, was a 16-week randomized controlled trial with 194 participants across Germany, Norway, and Sweden. Researchers replaced regular bread with oat beta-glucan-enriched bread and found no significant improvement in long-term HbA1c, fasting glucose, or insulin in people at risk of type 2 diabetes. Co-author Professor Jutta Dierkes summed up the takeaway, saying, quote, "Our study underscores the importance of a whole diet approach rather than relying on single food substitutions," end quote. No single bread swap will cure diabetes. But the difference between reaching for a bread with a glycemic index of 36 versus one at 75, repeated across thousands of meals over months and years, compounds into real metabolic benefit. Let me pull everything together. The 3 best breads for diabetics, all backed by clinical evidence, are: number 1, sprouted grain bread like Ezekiel 4.9 with a glycemic index of 36 to 50 and the lowest blood sugar response in head-to-head trials, including trials in people with type 2 diabetes. Number 2, authentic sourdough bread with a glycemic index of 48 to 54, where the fermentation process physically alters the starch and delays gastric emptying, with strong evidence in people with impaired glucose tolerance. Number 3, dense whole grain bread with intact kernels, especially pumpernickel, with a glycemic index of 41 to 46, where the physical grain structure resists rapid digestion. One principle ties all 3 together: starch structural integrity. The harder your digestive enzymes have to work to reach the glucose, the flatter your blood sugar curve. Here's what to do starting today. Pick breads from these 3 categories and lean toward thin sliced varieties to manage portions. Store your bread in the freezer and toast slices before eating. Always pair bread with protein and healthy fat. And eat your vegetables and protein before touching the bread. Read labels carefully every time and look for 100% whole grain as the very first ingredient. If you have access to a continuous glucose monitor, test these breads individually to see which works best for your unique physiology. If this helped you, share it with someone you know who manages diabetes or prediabetes. Remember, more than half of American seniors have prediabetes, which means someone close to you could benefit from hearing this today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself.